Hello and welcome to Move Conversations. This is your host, Venkat. This is the second part of the Move Conversations interview with the best-selling author, speaker, and policy strategy expert, Miss Michele Wucker. In part one, we discussed her best-selling book, The Grey Rhino. In part two, we discussed with her her new book, just released a couple of months back in 2021, You Are What You Risk, the new art and science of navigating an uncertain world. Let me begin with an interesting trivia that I read in your book. People were more likely to take more risk shortly after eating spicy food. Please tell us about this Chinese research that has found a strong correlation between liking spicy food and risk seeking.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was one of those really, wow moments in the research that I discovered. And of course there are lots of stereotypes that people have about people who like spicy food. Oh, they must be big risk takers, and you can think that actually might be a little bit of something. I mean, generally I'm not a fan of stereotypes, but if you it doesn't matter whether you like spicy food or not. It's just like if you had it. And I think it's a very interesting sort of geographical, social cultural context, because I mean, like, of course, India has wonderful spicy food, or like
Thanks.
Mexico, or like Thailand,
Right.
places where are very hot. And then, you read about them, and you read way back in the days before there was refrigeration, the spices help to, kill whatever might grow in there
Bacteria, right?
without refrigeration and things.
Bacteria.
And so, but it's interesting because the spices on the one level make it somewhat safer, but they also kind of mask whatever kind of questionable thing.
Yep,
So they make it safer and they make it riskier at the same time. And so I don't know if it's that we've just sort of like internalized the fact that there are all these risk decisions that went into the food being spicy in the first place, or not. But I mean, I went to school in Texas, to junior high school and college in Texas, and I had a friend who moved to California right afterwards. And of course, in Texas, we love spicy food. And in California, they have this sort of Cal-Mex version of Mexican food that's not nearly as spicy. And so she was out to dinner with some friends, and they had this salsa. They're like, "Oh, this is so hot. Oh, terrible." She's like, "That's not hot." They're like, "Oh, but it's so hot." She's like, "No, it's not hot." They're like, "Oh, it's so hot." So she picks up a bowl. She drinks the whole thing, puts it down, and says, "It's not hot."
I can understand that, right? Yeah.
It goes due to like how used to things you are.
Right.
Because people, I live in the Midwest now in Chicago, where people don't eat spicy food, and so something that I would say is not hot, they would say, "Oh, it's crazy hot." So it actually has to do with your relationship to things around you, your experiences, your practice, what you're used to. So spicy on a certain level isn't even just objective, because it's completely different to different people depending on their experience.
Correct. You talk about the Sichuan and Chongqing people, right? And I think there are parallels to regions in India where people eat a lot of spicy food, and quite a few of them are actually, I think, well-known traders, risk takers, entrepreneurs of the kind that like other people will say like, "Oh, that's very risky business," but like these people are very well known, historically, to have traded in geographies which people think is risky, traded in products, and developed sophisticated instruments and transactions and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm sure that there should be more research to find out what
and it really goes to
justification.
say, it depends on your perspective. I feel so bad for waiters in a Thai restaurant in the Midwest, who they say, "Okay, how spicy would you like something?" And they have no idea what the person in front of them considers to be spicy,
yeah, exactly,
or not. So how much they're risking, like having to send the dish back to the kitchen because they have misjudged what they think that the person thinks is spicy.
When our family goes to non-Thai or non-Indian restaurants, we just say like yeah, spicy, whatever is your highest level, because our tolerance level is manageable still.
And it's still probably mild for people who are used to spices.
So that brings us to risk personalities also, right? When we talk about risk personalities, the classic question, how much is nature, how much is nurture, comes up. So what's the role of family, society, culture and work environment, and what did you find in your research?
Well, it's interesting. Again, it's like a room full of funhouse mirrors that, when you observe things, they change. And and it's why I talk about a risk fingerprint, which pulls together your innate personality, your experiences, your upbringing, your peers, your environment, and even, what you had for lunch
Yeah.
and how you respond to it.
Just discussed.
Because there's a certain amount of our innate personality that we just can't change. And there's a very interesting tool I talk about called the Risk Type Compass, developed in the UK,
Right.
which basically has 8 personality types, and then how strong you are, it's how strongly you're connected to each one of those types, how flexible you are, and that basically uses Big Five personality type theory
Right.
to look at how anxious or calm you are when you're dealing with a risk, and how methodical or impulsive you are, and how all of those come together. But so then there are the experiences that you've gone through, and it was interesting. I interviewed some people who'd gone through terrible experiences and became much more comfortable with uncertainty, with risk taking, and doing things that some of us would think, oh, that's a huge risk, but they actually set everything up around it so that the risk was minimized. So I mean, like Mark Pollock, the who's the first blind man to race across the South Pole, who later became paralyzed, and who still does amazing things, and he's out on this race to find a cure for paralysis in his lifetime.
Wow.
Not risky, not difficult at all. And so there's him and other entrepreneurs who've gone through very difficult things, who use that, who learn, if they've developed a risk-taking muscle, and they get better at doing things. But then there was someone I talked to who he in his 40s recently become the CEO of a Central American family conglomerate, where the older generations had gone through the sort of civil wars, where much of their assets were seized, and they became very, very conservative. Similarly, I talked to adult children of Holocaust survivors, whose family became very, very conservative. They wanted to minimize risk as much as possible, and so all of these people went through really difficult times, and some of them embraced risk afterwards, and other ones didn't. And so for me, there is an interaction between the experience and the innate personality, and then also the habits that you take, the habits that you develop, the people around you. Even when I went into some of the neurobiological parts of this, like the spicy food, is the temperature in the room, the music that you're listening to, sort of the physical environment that you create. So all of these come together to create your risk fingerprint, which is who you are. And then the decisions that you make, the choices that you take, the risks that you make, really tell the world who you are, much as a fingerprint on a glass at a crime scene.
Right. So when we talk about the risk fingerprint, you're talking about saying that, like, it's not it's definitely the experiences matter, they influence, but in addition, it's like cultures, demographics, nations. So overall context seems to be important, right?
Absolutely. It really struck me when I was writing the book how much the cultural, the national, the policy element affected people. It's like I was talking in the first section of this interview about how in China they're much more long-term thinking about risks, much more aware, much more willing to talk about certain kinds of risks publicly at the highest level than America. I was giving a talk at a high school in Milwaukee. And one of the people in the audience, this was when they were debating where healthcare was going to go in the States, if they were going to sort of take away the Obamacare provisions. And she said that she saw a huge increase in patients coming in with sort of stress and mental health issues because they were freaked out about the possibility of losing their healthcare. So that was a very clear example of this, relationship between the bigger level and the personal level. And of course, during the pandemic, every country has dealt with it in different ways. Some of them recognized it more quickly than others. Some of them acted faster to put in public health measures. there's a big variety in, how stringent and extensive those were, how long they lasted, big variety in how governments communicated the risk and how people took it. And in the United States, of course, it's almost like we have two different countries.
Right.
And so it is very hard to separate the personal from that at a bigger policy level, which of course is where I come from. I was a little bit, I felt like it was very risky writing a book that went into the personal side of risk, because I'm not a self-help author. I'm much more comfortable with 30,000-foot policy stuff and business strategy. And it was really making that connection between the two that made me realize how important that conversation was to have.
Right. So the one aspect of policy that, when you gave these examples of withdrawal of Obamacare or the fear of it and so on, and other policies that may affect people. So that sort of triggers my question. Does having safety nets, maybe in the business community, or safety nets generally provided by government, does it increase or decrease risk taking? We discussed the healthcare and Obamacare kind of situations, but I'm taking the same aspect, but like wanting to explore the other side of it, right? Like, do people? What did your research show? Whether people take more risk, less risk? What is happening? What has research shown?
I think it depends on the kind of risk. I mean, on the one hand, we have the moral hazard. The businesses going and making terrible risks, assuming that they're going to be bailed out by the government and the taxpayers are going to do it. Like, that's obviously something we want less of. But then there are the good risks, like investing in education. I mean, as a teenager finishing high school, going to college is like the biggest risk decision of your entire life. Your brain's not entirely developed to make that decision properly. And it's a completely different risk depending on your family's socioeconomic circumstances. Whether you think you're going to get a job that's good enough to pay back for this investment. And it's different for everyone. You've seen this research saying that, people who have names or hobbies that seem quote unquote ethnic on the resumes are less likely to get interviews and less likely to get jobs. And so all the factors that go into that risk decision are completely different for every person. And, how much the government pays for it and how much the government cracks down if, for example, there's a scam university. We had a big issue a few years back with for-profit colleges, including some founded by people with very prominent commonly known names, which I won't mention.
Let's not take names. I'm familiar.
But it's all these factors coming together. And so, risk itself sometimes is very hard to define, because there's such a huge subjective part that depends on the context. The same risk is not the same possibility of loss or gain to different people. So it's like a room full of funhouse mirrors. The more you look at the factors, things change. So and that's very, very hard for a lot of people to keep in their head. People don't like complexity. They don't like uncertainty. They don't like ambiguity. But I think we need to be thinking about risk that way.
Yeah, right. So let's move on to talk about the gender hormones and risk, because I saw something very interesting there. The new cite of findings by Singapore Management University researchers, and they did this research jointly with others, that male traders with higher testosterone levels end up with worse returns overall than the lower testosterone managers. So, the popular narratives in films and television and even the business media is that they glorify the high testosterone executives. So that's not correct. Is that the case?
I think it's time to really take a new look at that, and the whole question of gender and risk, which is, as you know, I go into quite a bit in the book. There are a lot of things that people think they know that the research doesn't completely bear out. This women are more risk averse thing. It doesn't hold up. Julie Nelson at University of Boston did a very, very interesting study applying new statistical techniques to past studies that used averages instead of ranges of reactions. And she said there's a 95% overlap between
it was very interesting
how
statistics
much
that you
risk.
put. Yeah.
But there are nuances in it, in that, women are, there's evidence that women are more likely to take social risks, saying the thing that nobody wants to hear. And why is it? Because a lot of women, particularly in business, start out, they're the only woman in the room.
Right.
Full of men. And, of course, we know about, groupthink from reading Ray Reiner, that when you have a bunch of people who look alike, they kind of, really buckle down, double down on each other's opinions. And so saying anything as someone who looks different in the room is a much greater social risk than for anyone else in the room. So women have a lot more practice at taking social risks. And so it's like a muscle, when you do it, you get better at it. But there are some variations that depend on education and experience. And some of the research also shows that in situations where a woman and a man have no experience or little experience, in that case, the men are just going to kind of go through and do what from the outside looks like taking more risk. Now, that may be because they don't perceive it as much of a risk. It may be because they just don't think about it at all. I mean, similar, for children, everything is hugely risky because it's new, but it's also not risky because they don't know the dangers. So there are some differences between men and women. There are some differences certainly in the hormones. And there's I think there's a lot we really don't know yet about hormones and genetics. I think people are really digging through all of that. But that women also are likely to have a somewhat different process. They're going to want the information. They're going to want to ask the experts. And it's actually a much wiser, much savvier way of dealing with risk. But people tend to sort of pejoratively talk about women as, risk averse, because they're asking the questions that needed to be asked. And I'm actually trying to get rid of the word risk averse entirely, because it's usually not used the way people think it is meant. And I think we need to be talking about how you make the decisions. What's the process? And certainly look at the neurobiology of it, look at the training, look at the education, look at the types of risks involved. I mean, there's other research that shows men are more likely to take risks like, speeding or, with alcohol or, things like that. There are some differences, but I think in a business context, we need to be looking a lot more at the kind of risk savvy that women bring to decisions.
So, when you were elaborating on that, you touched upon seeking other people's opinion. You touched upon the sort of lack of diversity in rooms and, in teams and so on. So in organizations, should we have teams with people of different risk profiles, or should we have similar? So I'm not moving into the gender aspect alone, right? Because you said that, like, if there are a lot of similarity in certain decisions they take, then it could be we should move to discussing the risk profile of the person rather than gender or ethnicity of the person. So in that context, should we have more people with similar risk profile or different risk profiles?
Yeah, I think having, different risk types, different risk fingerprints among people in the room is such a powerful risk mitigation tool, but also helps you to better take opportunities, because, you remember, the risk has a flip side. There's the downside and the upside. And, if you're not taking the bad risks, you might not also be taking some of the good risks. And when we talk about board diversity and that, it tends to look at gender or, ethnicity. People, I think, are paying some attention to the need for different professional backgrounds. If you have a room full of engineers, you're going to get one output. If it's a room full of lawyers, you're going to get something else. But I don't think there's been enough attention yet to the risk component of that. I mean, actually, engineers are going to have a very different risk type from contract lawyers or from litigators. Those are also, very different.
And marketing professionals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's funny,
we will talk and solve everything in the world.
There's one lawyer I talked to who he had wore two hats. He was chief counsel for a company, but he was also the head of marketing distribution. Two completely different risk brains. And he, he could shift between them. And I think he really learned a lot of empathy towards different positions. And I think that's really important when you've got people coming from different perspectives about risk, understanding why somebody else is coming at their opinion the way they are. But it's, looking specifically at different risk types in a room and risk fingerprints, you can look at the problem from different perspectives. You might be, somebody who inherently thinks about risk as a negative thing might not be thinking about missing an opportunity as an equal risk. And somebody who is gung-ho about any possible chance to make a ton of money might not be looking enough at the possibilities for what might go wrong.
Exactly.
And with any sort of diversity of thought, it takes an investment of time and, some discomfort. I mean, it's often uncomfortable to talk about things with someone who doesn't come from the same point of view that you do.
True.
But when you can look at it clearly as this is why this person thinks about it differently, it kind of depersonalizes it. It diffuses the situation, and it allows you to have the conversation in a much more rational way. It's like if you're going on a business trip with someone and you have to share a cab to the airport and you can't agree about how much time to leave to get to the airport. If you could just say, hey, this is how, I mean, like for me, like I have, global entry and TSA pre, the stuff that gets you through the lines really quickly. And that's really great. But there have been a couple times where I just barely made it on. There was one where I only made it on because the flight was delayed by 10 minutes. And after a couple of those experiences, and they were traffic related, I'm like, I'm going to leave the extra time. I'm going to have an extra drink in the lounge ahead of time. And like, I leave more time than probably a lot of people would. And it's because of those experiences. And so if I'm talking to someone who's got to, ride in the cab with me, I'm gonna say, hey, this is why. And I want to know, why you're coming from, where you're coming from. And once you can put it in those terms, those personal stories, you're like, oh yeah, okay, I can meet you in the middle. It makes it much easier to do when you realize that risk fingerprint element of why people are making a decision that they are.
True. Right. So you also cite a very interesting research, and I quote, like people whose languages did not require them to add a future time reference were much more future oriented than those whose languages distinguish between present and future tense. And she also even give examples of languages which has got like more than 2-3 examples of future, of specificity of future tense. I mean, in some of the Indian languages, you can go up to 2 or 3, but then like this is like some numbers that you quoted were like much more. So back to the main point. Future time references, if they didn't have it in their language, they were much more future oriented. So since Mandarin does not have that tense, did they find those speakers more focused on future than other language speakers?
In the Gray Rhino, I wrote a lot about long-term versus short-term thinking, and the countries where you've got more 300-year-old companies
Japan
are in Asia. You get a lot more of that in Asia than in the West. And the other thing I found to be very interesting, and this wasn't so much language oriented, but that when it came to technological change and AI, people in Asia thought that it was coming much faster than Westerners did. There was a study they asked people, when is high-level machine intelligence going to happen? Which is, when machines can do pretty much everything better than humans. And, the Asians were looking at, 30-something years out, and the Westerners were like, 70-something years. So it's actually a completely different perception of the time as well. And, I think one of the reasons that the Gray Rhino caught on in a big way first in Asia was because people are able to think longer term, because they've got different risk perceptions. And I think that really had to do with it. When I went to China, people would say, you helped us, you gave us a way to talk about the thing that was on our mind. And it's, and I think, old civilizations like that. I mean, the US is still just like a baby in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's the language, it's the experiences, it's a bunch of things that come together. But how we look at time is really an important component of risk, because you look at how people often discount things that are too far in the future, and they overemphasize short-term things, and it's a real issue, particularly in the West, where I think we really suffer from it.
Right. So in Asia, and more specifically East Asia, it resonates with people, and you could give them a metaphor, and they could talk about it, which they anyway like are, as you said, by their nature, by their nurture, they they're more future focused probably, right? So talking of entrepreneurs, you say that contrary to popular belief, most of them are not high risk takers, but only sort of moderate risk takers. So, could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. And this again is a case of a big difference between the stereotype, the outer image,
Right.
and the difference between, subjective risk and objective risk, like what the risk really is and what you perceive it as. Because, you can have two people doing the same thing, doing a bungee jump, and someone who's done it 1,000 times and has like read all the manuals. It's a very different, they perceive it differently, and it actually is less of a risk than someone who's doing it for the first time, and it's just like a lark, and they were drunk and someone, challenge, dared them to do it for their birthday. And so I think entrepreneurs are kind of like that. Entrepreneurs tend to look in much greater detail at all the things that need to happen. There are some studies that show that some of them believe that there's a greater likelihood of success than reality actually is. So, in that sense, they may be perceiving a risk as smaller than it is in real life, but that's offset by the fact that they're doing their homework.
Right.
And they also may be weighing risks differently. When I was researching the book, I asked a lot of people, what's the biggest risk you've ever taken? And then after the book came out, a bunch of reporters kept throwing that back at me, smarty pants. And so I was, talking about a risk involving a decision between, career and health. And as I described the logic to them, I realized that the bigger risk, even though it seemed risky to like leave a secure finance job and go off and write a book about a country that, two countries that didn't get a lot of attention, that seemed really risky to the outside. But in my logic, I realized that was the smaller of the two risks. And the other was, staying in a job where I felt I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, where I wasn't fulfilling my potential. And I felt like I would just, I'm sort of lucky in that my health gives me a warning signal when I'm not happy, which makes it very hard to do things that I don't enjoy, and I get bored easily. So that's a real challenge to manage. But I realized that what I needed to be asking, as well as what's the biggest risk you've ever taken, is what's the biggest risk you've ever not taken?
Right.
And I spoke to some entrepreneurs in the book who went through exactly that process. Nicole Vasquez, who's one of the co-founders of Despass, was in a job where she just like worked her butt off, and she was, youngest person to be promoted. And then her boss was like, look, and it did it in a nice way, was saying, hey, you're working these crazy hours, but you've already been promoted. The odds of you getting promoted again are pretty low, kind of, just like be better to yourself. And she thought about it, and she's like, is this where I want to be long term? And so she went off and she became an entrepreneur, and it was absolutely the right decision. And so even though to people on the outside, what she did seemed very risky, she did a very, very sensible assessment of what was best for her and what the biggest risks were and weren't. And you're seeing that more and more today. I mean, I keep seeing these stories of the great resignation. During the pandemic, people are quitting their jobs because their jobs aren't giving them what they want anymore. And in some cases, people are saying you have to come back to the office is kind of the final straw. And so that calculation between the bigger risk being, working for a control freak boss who can't make a decision and, who might be replaced someday with someone who's, who's even harder, who wants all their own people. I mean, that's having all your eggs in one basket kind of risk. And there's another bit of research that I cite in the book about people who, solopreneurs and, people who start their own businesses. And for them, having a diversified source of income and having control over their business and the people they work for was a huge risk mitigation factor. So again, it's one of those things. It
Right.
depends on what angle you're looking at it from.
Right. If you would permit me to share, because this particular point resonated with me, because even before I had read your book and this particular point, I've had this discussion coming up with my students, and they typically talk about entrepreneurs, risk taking, and etc. etc. And their opinions are molded mostly shaped by the media profiles of. So one of the questions I used to ask them, and so mine is not research based, but sort of anecdotal, but from personal experiences. So my point was hey, look at any country. Majority of the businesses are small and medium enterprises. Many of them, almost all of them, are entrepreneurs. Right. And then I said that as a physical goods trader in my life, not only in this part of the world, in my career, but even in the countries that I traded with in Africa, in Latin America, and so on, all those people were all entrepreneurs, right? But immediately we think of entrepreneur as only the Steve Jobs and the other people who drop out of Harvard or Stanford, but these are all entrepreneurs who run SMEs and so on. So my counter question to my students used to be that many of them actually run Me Too businesses. So if every one of them was really the risk-taking type, then they wouldn't be even running many Me Too businesses. So I don't know. Do you think that's also another aspect of it which we just ignore because we don't sort of think much about those people as the entrepreneurs, and we have more fancy ideas about the ones who get media coverage?
It's I think that smaller entrepreneurs don't get enough credit. And I'd look in particular at my first two books were about immigration, and I did quite a bit for a while on immigrants and the economy and workforce integration and things. And so you'd see all these stories coming out about how immigrants were such big risk takers.
Right.
But when you look at this, risky compared to what, if it's someone who's come from a war-torn country, mm-hmm. the risk of even taking a very dangerous journey are smaller. And then they come to a new country, and you look at the sort of social capital and all of the things that reduce risk for someone who's grown up someplace. They've got an uncle who can get them an internship with this company that leads to a job, and that they know certain people. And for an immigrant in a new country, in many cases, they do tend to go to the communities of people from their country. Right. And in many cases, they don't have the connections. They don't have, other things that they need to get into a more traditional job. And so that mom and pop business is the thing that makes the most sense, and actually in a certain way is the, quote unquote, least risky.
Exactly. Path. Moderate risk takers. That's what we think of the business. But as you say, from their life perspective, it could be on a different level.
But then at the same time, you see Silicon Valley. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I remember over the years, the percentage of successful businesses, in particular, unicorns that were founded by immigrants is actually quite high. Quite and high. That involves, in many cases, people who had a lot of social capital in their home country and, broader networks and much, higher education. And, True. They had some of the things that allowed them to take those risks. But I think once you've taken the risk of moving to a different country and all of the dealing with uncertainty that involves, that primes you in a certain way. Exactly. It builds your risk muscle.
Absolutely. So, talking of risk, and in part one of our conversation, you briefly touched upon it. The world of finance is comfortable with risk, but hates uncertainty. So could you revisit that concept for this discussion, and then elaborate on it as to why?
Yeah, well, the thing about quantifying risk is it allows you to have a business model.
Correct.
It allows you to make estimations of how much does it really cost me to insure someone, how do I write a life insurance policy when, you have these actuarial tables that will tell you that 64-year-old woman who doesn't smoke is likely to live X number of years, and you've got some data. And when you have data that allows you to make predictions with considerably more precision, that makes it so much easier to have a business model. And throughout history, these ships, that would go, from Africa, from Latin America to Europe to the United States and back. I mean, huge amount of risk in that. And it was actually maritime insurance that made this possible. And you look at so many other business activities where being able to quantify with it some reasonable degree of certainty is really essential for making that work. And so, there are some people, the people call themselves disruptors, who thrive on uncertainty and, finding little pockets of uncertainty in this crazy world. But that's a special kind of person, a special kind of attitude. Most people in business, or, in life, most people in the world don't really like that. And we have to have systems that work for most people in the world. So the ability to price risk is very, very, very important. And, in our personal decisions, maybe we're not assigning like a numerical price, but we've got a sort of a price in our heads, more than or less than, pass fail kind of price. So it is important. And I can see why businesses like certainty. In fact, there's a term I've heard thrown around, an uncertainty tax. That, we certainly during the previous 4 years in the United States, we had a lot of that, and it made it very, very hard for businesses to make decisions, particularly long-term decisions.
True. Having dealt with many emerging economies, I perfectly understand the concept of uncertainty tax, because you're dealing with such markets, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in there. In your book, you also say that, I believe that Friedman's argument, that there is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that is to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profit. So you say that argument has outlived its usefulness. So, despite you being based in Chicago, what you see has changed in the free market economies.
Well, first of all, what Americans talk about as free market economy often is not actually free market. It's set up the playing field so that the advantage goes to the United States. Or
certain people who have taken care of certain other people.
So when I hear free market, I'm like, that doesn't mean what you think it means.
Yeah, exactly. It's free for me, not for you type.
Yeah, but aside from that, the whole shareholder versus the newer stakeholder capitalism models. I think the thing that Friedman missed was that they're not mutually exclusive.
Right.
We've seen so many cases where, companies have been bad actors, and the reputational costs are huge. So if you're not paying attention to things that are going to affect your reputation, you're not actually looking out for your shareholders' interests. Or I think the biggest example of that is fossil fuels. There's a company, it's an industry based on huge government subsidies and huge externalities that everybody else is paying for. And that, it's a very, very narrow focus. And we're seeing that if that continues, there's not going to be anything. We're not going to have a planet. We're not going to have anything. And, investors are seeing too that, hey, okay, yeah, I'm making a ton of money from my fossil fuel investments, but I am taking a bath on my coastal real estate investments, on my municipal bonds, because so many cities, the economic model is based on being on a body of water. And we're seeing, too much water, too little water. You're seeing all these, wildfires and things like that. And so, the whole fossil fuel industry, in terms of, if their shareholders live on planet Earth, they are not looking out for their shareholders. So I think we need to stop thinking about it as a zero-sum
And
gain.
embrace the stakeholder concept, right?
Absolutely. And, there's been a lot of criticism of, some companies that give lip service to the stakeholder model, and some of them are walking the walk, not just talking the talk. And I think
Right.
that's a fair criticism. I think we really need to weed that out, similarly with, ESG and greenwashing. I think that it's important to be able to distinguish which companies are really serious, where, their actions matter more than
Right.
just their words. But at the same time, you got to start with the words. Like,
Right.
until you have the words, you don't get the action. And
True.
so I think it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
True. So, I just mentioned like that, my background was in international trade, and especially in consumer goods, between Asia, Africa, Latin America, and so Middle East and so on. So, one of the quotes that I liked in your book was, when the party that's best able to bear the risk does so, both parties are better off. Actually, most of our suppliers in my previous life, so to say, our suppliers, our customers, were not comfortable with the risk in dealing directly with each other. So we, as an intermediary, or as a trading company, we added value by providing sourcing, marketing, logistic, all these value additions. And even more importantly, we also bore the financial risk in doing business in these uncertain markets. So my question is, why governments and even societies often do not acknowledge even the risk taking and the risk bearing value addition that middlemen provide?
Yeah, it's such an important conversation. And of course, the comment came partly from Marina Krakowski's work on the middleman economy, and that role of sort of, brokering risk. And I think that, I often say that the risk decisions that a society makes tell the world who it is, just as much as, individual decisions, are the imprint of our risk fingerprint. And I think the way societies decide who bears the risk,
Right,
both tells the world who they are, and it also determines how successful they're going to be or not. In the conclusion of the book, I speak with the artist Drew Kataoka, who talks about, Michelangelo and these big, immortal works. And how was it that those came about? I mean, yes, it was these, amazing, charismatic people with dreams, but it was the patrons, it was the financial backers, it was the people who provided the environment that allowed them to really make those stretches. And an author whose work I love is Mariana Mazzucato. Her most recent book, the Mission Economy. Talking about the times when government assumes risk, and the kind of things like solving climate change, areas, or creating the internet, areas where it took a big risk that no single company would do, and then how the profits of those risks that the government takes, how those are distributed. And in many cases, they're then again, privatized by particular companies who were there in the right place. Or, you look at even just the whole, the whole pandemic situation, public health decisions made by governments, and, some companies have had the red carpet laid out for them. Other companies, not so much. Some people have ended up very well from all of the money printing. Other people are still struggling and losing their homes. And it's, who gets protected? Do the most vulnerable bear the most risk? Do the people who are the most protected get subsidized the most? And those are really big questions that are hugely important. And they're not just for moral reasons or whatever people might come up with for, yes, you've got to protect the vulnerable from risk, but it's also about creating the kind of conditions that allow the Michelangelos of the world to thrive, that allow the big breakthrough developments, the kind of ecosystems that support the growth of businesses and jobs and innovation and creativity and really successful countries. So it's one of the most important questions that a country can ask itself.
Right. That's a wonderful point for us to bring this discussion to an end. And given our backgrounds, I think we can go on discussing on and on. And I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. It was our pleasure to explore all these things at length about both your books, The Grey Rhino and You Are What You Risk, the more recent ones. Thanks for taking time from your day schedule for this. We learned a lot about, dealing with known high impact, high probable risks that many of us ignore. And related to that, is that our risk profile as individuals, as organizations, and even nations. So, and this is influenced both by our nature, nurture, which is social, religious, political, economic, all the things, right? Legal, historical, geographical context that you spoke about. So I'm sure that our audiences will also benefit a lot from your book and your research. So if any of them want to know more about your work or reach out to you, what's your company's website, link, and contact details and so on?
Sure. So you can reach me at thegrayrhino.com.
Mhm.
Gray with an A or an E will get you there.
Right.
With an A will get you there faster, the American spelling. I'm on Twitter at Wucker, Wucker, and you can also find me on LinkedIn, where I have a semi-regular newsletter that I send out. Trying to make it more regular, but life. But thank you so much for your very, very thoughtful and thorough questions, and a really, really a lovely, engaging conversation. So really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. And it's because of your book, it stimulated so much thought in me. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us in yet another episode of Move Conversations. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe to the Move Conversations YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get notifications of new episodes. Thank you very much. Till I see you in the next episode. Thank you very much. Have a great day.